Okay, I think we can begin. I'm Fred Murphy with the Marxist Education Project, and we're very happy today to welcome the editors and several of the participants from contributors to a new book, Marxism and the Capitalist State. I'll be turning this over to Rob Hunter, who's one of the editors of the book, in a moment. Just wanted to go over a couple of just housekeeping ground rules type things. I posted into the chat a notice about the recording and our privacy policy. You're welcome to participate in the meeting, but by speaking orally or keeping your camera on, you're agreeing to be recorded. Otherwise, you may, of course, remain anonymous. And then after the initial panel presentations, we will open up for Q&A and comments, which we will ask you to put in the chat. Since we have a very large group today, we'll be monitoring the chat and compiling those into questions and perhaps calling on some of you to make your comments directly. But having said that, again, we're very happy to have you all here, and I'll turn it over to Rob Hunter.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you everyone for coming. This is a great turnout. We're very excited. My name is Rob Hunter. I'm one of the editors of the volume, along with Rafael Khatchaturian and Eva Nanopoulos, who are both here as well. Rafael teaches critical writing at the University of Pennsylvania, and Eva teaches law at Queen Mary College London. And we are also joined today by several contributors. Alyssa Battistoni, who teaches political science at Barnard. Nate Holdren, who teaches law, politics, and society, I believe is the name of your program, Nate, at Drake University. And Chris O'Kane, who teaches political economy at St. John's University. Because we have such a large turnout, we're going to try and make time for as lengthy a Q&A session as possible. I am sure that there are going to be many great questions and a lively discussion, and we do want to make that happen. But before doing so, I will give a brief presentation, simply summarizing the book, what our motivations for producing it were, and what our goals for it are, and summarizing the chapters of the contributors who could not join us today, very briefly, of course, before turning it over to Alyssa, and then to Nate, and then to Chris. And then, of course, we will get into the Q&A. So just to begin by situating the book and how we see it fitting in with the existing literature, it's become something of a truism to say that since the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, that we've been in the middle of a revival of interest in Marx and Marxism. But if that's the case, it hasn't been accompanied by a revived interest, in critiquing the capitalist state. Many of the most influential Marxist analyses of the capitalist state date from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Attention to these historical debates is necessary but not sufficient. The core theme of the book is an insistence on a renewed commitment to systematic critique of the state as an essential feature of capitalist society. It's also important to note that Marx himself did not offer a fully developed theory of the state. The subsequent tradition, or traditions plural, of Marxist engagements with the capitalist state display a wide range of very different views. But they do all share an emphasis on the importance of the state to capitalism, and the importance of the capitalist state in Marxist theory and analysis. And the state looms very large indeed beyond Marxist theory, or rather Marxist theory illuminates the ways that it is crucially important and relevant today. We're in a moment of mounting ecological catastrophe, sustained imperialist violence, the immiseration, marginalization, and extermination of people who have been expelled from the circuits of capital, and the ongoing exploitation of the vast majority of people worldwide who own little or nothing other than their own labor power. States discipline the working class and enforce the exchange of that labor power. They act as the necessary moments in a transnational regime of capital accumulation and circulation. And in their demarcation of borders, they regulate, contain, and exclude populations from defined national and international spaces. Finally, they help to restrain emancipatory social movements, channeling those movements' disruptive potential into palatable social reforms. For all these reasons and more, that's why we feel that it's incredibly urgent to offer a critique of the capitalist state today. I'm not going to try to summarize the entire book or even the introductory chapter that was written by Eva, Rafael, and I, but I do want to focus on a couple of themes that recur frequently throughout the book and that are touched upon by many of the chapters. The first is the idea of the relative autonomy of the political from the economic. So according to the relative autonomy thesis, the state is not a superstructure reflecting a base of economic relations. It's not an instrument of the capitalist class, and it's not an autonomous subject that freely implements any given policy. Instead, it's both conditioned by and it conditions class struggle and the production and circulation of commodities. The theorists who rely on this approach often describe the capitalist state as a particular terrain that is fought over and it also molds the antagonists who fight within that terrain. This approach is most closely associated with Louis Althusser and Nikos Poulantzas, but it's been widely adopted in many other currents. And I think it's safe to say that the phrase relative autonomy enjoys currency even outside of Marxism. The other concept that I want to highlight here is the idea of the state as an historically specific social form. This is an idea that's associated with and has been developed within several traditions, including Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, the German New Reading of Marx, and Open Marxism. The claim here is that the capitalist state is historically specific, and it is a social form, and as such, it's an appearance of a particular historically determinate form of society. The state is not a distinct social sphere, rather it's the specifically political appearance of the determinate social relations of capitalist society. These are not the only themes that come up in the book, of course, but we're going to be touching upon both of them in the various presentations today and no doubt during the Q&A, so I thought it was important to highlight them here. Finally, I would just like to summarize the chapters in the volume. I'm not going to touch on Alyssa's or Nate's or Chris's. They'll have an opportunity to talk about theirs at length, and I'm really looking forward to that. But I do want to just say a few sentences about each of the others. So Dimitris Kivotidis writes about the increasing digitalization of social life in the 21st century and the prospects for the automation of socialist management of production. The increasing mediation of social and political life by social media and so-called digital platforms do not have any inherent emancipatory potential. These technologies do not constitute a neutral or autonomous historical force. They are social relations that arise out of and are conditioned by capitalism. Digitalization can only contribute to democratic decision-making if it's conjoined with struggles for the democratic control of production itself. Rafael, in his chapter, examines the social crisis that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic through the lens of the role and capacities of the capitalist state. He suggests that the coronavirus exacerbated a crisis of social reproduction, one that the state has been consistently incapable of meeting. This is not a revolutionary window of opportunity, but a prolonged interregnum. It's one in which the state continues to facilitate capitalist accumulation, even while its reproductive and ideological roles come under further strain. Stephen Mara and Scott Aquano document the development and the consolidation of central banking's insulation from nominally democratic parliamentary oversight. They also explored the increasing dependence of global capital accumulation on specific U.S. institutions like the Federal Reserve. According to them, these institutions constitute a financial branch of government, and this financial branch is of central importance to global capitalism, and it's a key example of what Mara and Aquano call the structural integration of state power with the capitalist economy. Jasmine Chorley-Schultz writes about soldiers as workers that are employed by capitalist states. The distinction between soldiers and civilians is often fetishized as a transhistorical feature of any or all societies. But for Chorley-Schultz, it's impossible to make sense of the role of the military except within the context of historical class antagonism and class struggle. She explores the relationship between industrial production and the military activity of the capitalist state, as well as the state's abiding interest in the cultivation of what Engels called human material in the pursuit of state military superiority over rival states. Eva's chapter is on what she calls the war emergency paradigm. This paradigm is a primary mode of governing by the contemporary capitalist state. This paradigm consists of the deployment of the language of war, of security, and of threats, coupled with recourse to exceptions to day-to-day legality. She considers some of the dilemmas that are raised when it comes to responding to crises such as pandemics or climate change, which require urgent and coordinated action on the one hand, but they also require radical ruptures with the ordinary institutions and processes that define capitalist governance. Kirsten Monroe's chapter is an imminent critique of social reproduction theory. She argues that socially reproductive labor is not separable from, quote, the exploitation and domination that are inherent to the organization of production and reproduction in capitalism, end quote. For Monroe, social reproduction in capitalism is always the reproduction of a specifically capitalist society. Public sector and state employees are also complicit in the reproduction of that society. To the extent that they are directly engaged in the reproduction or credentialing of labor power, these workers are not engaged in some kind of pre-political or non-economic endeavor. They are making and remaking capitalist subjects. In his chapter, Michael McCarthy calls for charting a middle course between contingency and necessity when analyzing capitalist states. Unlike Monroe, for example, McCarthy contends that the capitalist state can and indeed has become a force for capital itself. A force against capital itself. However, the working class's capacity to turn the capitalist state against capital is mediated and constrained by its own atomization and decomposition. Capitalists, in turn, face a collective action problem as a class, and state personnel must juggle the competing imperatives of securing both the conditions for accumulation and the conditions for the sustained legitimation of state power. For McCarthy, only a conjunctural approach can make sense of such a situation, one in which the state is both the object and the terrain of class struggle. And then finally, in my chapter, I argue that the capitalist state is best understood as an historically specific form of social relations, and only in relation to and in the context of the totality of capitalist social relations. The capitalist state is the essential political determination of a society that is dominated by and reproduced through the accumulation of capital in the guise of self-valorizing value. I emphasize the historical specificity of such a state against the fetishism or the reification of treating states as a natural category. If we see the capitalist state as an historically specific social form, that helps us to understand that state violence and state coercion are appearances of the impersonal domination that characterizes capitalist society itself. So those are the chapters, excepting, of course, Alyssa's, Nate's, and Chris's, which we'll be hearing about in a moment. And taken together, all of these chapters do not even come close to exhausting the scope of the work that still needs to be done to map out the capitalist state's relations to the many aspects of domination and unfreedom under capitalism today. These include racialization and hierarchies constructed on the basis of race, ethnicity, and nationality, subordination and domination on the basis of sexuality and gender, and borders and violence directed against migrants, refugees, and the stateless. And there's so much more to be done, there's so much more to be said, and we'll be doing some of that saying today during the Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm going to pass the baton to Alyssa now.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob, for that great overview. And thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to the folks at MEP for inviting us to do this. I think it's a really important volume. It's, everything that Rob said is right. We really need a lot of work on this. So thanks to Rafael and Eva and Rob for all of their hard work over now a couple of years to put this together. So I am going to talk a little bit about my chapter, which is called State, Capital, Nature, State Theory for the Capitalist Scene. And as you can probably glean from the title, it is trying to think through the relationship of state and capital and nature. And, I want to echo some of Rob's opening comments and just saying, that I think this is something that has been, that is we really need more work on. the state, I think, has been surprisingly absent from a lot of recent work on nature and capital, nature and capitalism. And yet I think the state is particularly significant as a mediator between abstract capital and concrete nature. The territorial authority of the state makes it sort of a particularly significant in that relationship. And I can say more about why. But this chapter is really just an effort to start thinking about some of the dimensions of that sort of tripartite relationship. And it stems in many ways from, or sort of initially motivated in many ways from some debates in recent years about the state in sort of climate politics more generally. So, for decades, the main approach to climate policy was really just market mechanisms, right? So that was, carbon tax, cap and trade were sort of the two policy proposals on the agenda for a long time. In more recent years, we've seen debates over, on the one hand, calls for states to undertake more direct action in service of decarbonization, and also a new round of debates over whether we can expect the capitalist state to act in ways that challenge the interests of fossil capital. So this chapter is, in some ways addressing those kinds of debates at a higher level of abstraction, and really the core question is to appraise the conditions under which we might expect states in capitalist societies to act in order to prevent an ecological crisis or not. And it basically does that by bringing two debates in Marxist thought that I think have largely developed in parallel together. So first, that's a debate about nature amongst eco-Marxists, and second, a debate about the state amongst state theorists. And so, I put these in conversation. And I'm going to go through the arguments, but I want to say in advance that this is a pretty intentionally stylized approach to these debates. It's really trying to break down what I see as some larger questions and overarching tendencies that don't capture every aspect of what's happening in some of these debates. So keep that in mind. So, it starts by looking at, on the one hand, considering this central question of eco-Marxism, and here it is, what is the relationship between capitalism and nature? And there's a lot of agreement, of course, amongst eco-Marxist theorists, most of whom describe various ways that capital is destructive of nature. But what I focus on is whether, what I see as a divide on the question of whether capitalism's tendency to destroy nature is also a crisis for capitalism itself. So on the one hand, we have arguments that say that capitalism's destruction of nature is also self-destructive. It affects profitability, it interrupts processes of capital accumulation. And this is most famously argued by James O'Connor's second contradiction of capitalism, which draws on Polanyi most notably, but argues that capitalist crises may result from the underproduction of conditions of production like ecosystems, and that this crisis has to be resolved in some way. We've seen similar arguments in recent years by folks like Nancy Fraser and Jason Moore. And then on the other side of the debate, there's an argument that ecological crises are often devastating for human and non-human life, but they don't tend to have those consequences for capital accumulation itself. So John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett say there is no feedback mechanism between ecological degradation and economic crisis that would demand an immediate response by capital. So, there's a point at which basic ecological conditions, for instance, a habitable planet, are obviously required for ongoing capital accumulation. But, there are levels of devastating levels of ecological degradation might not have effects for capital itself. So the case against capitalism has to be made not on the basis of crisis or instability, but on the basis of sort of the harm it does to things outside itself. So that's sort of this one broad distinction I'm drawing in eco-Marxist debates, and then I turn to look at debates in Marxist state theory. Again, obviously, thinking about what is relation between capital and the state, what is sort of the state in capitalism, and here too we obviously have a lot of agreements amongst state theorists in different traditions. Critique of bourgeois theories of the state and the idea that the state is an autonomous institution with its own distinct logic, that it's an expression of sort of popular will and democratic theories, that it's just a neutral terrain that anyone can contest, as you see in a lot of pluralist political science, and an agreement that the modern state is specific to capitalist society. It does things that that capital itself can't, from securing private property to providing public goods and so on. So there's a lot of agreement here too. But I try to look at how different theorists understand the extent of political agency and sort of the degrees to which it's possible to use the state against capital, even in limited ways. And so I draw here on Raju Das's distinction from a paper that Das writes on the distinction between what he calls structural and class struggle approaches. And structuralist accounts are really emphasize the strong constraints on the state, the ways that the state is constituted by class society and accumulation such that it won't, and in some accounts, really can't act in ways that are counterposed to the general interests of capital or oriented towards non-capitalist ends. And the state here really can't, it's not only can't serve as sort of a vehicle to the transition to a new social order, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to redeploy for other purposes. And then class struggle approaches for Das again share some elements with the structuralist account. They still recognize limitations on the state, but also look to the ways that the class struggle may be played out within and through the state, the ways that the state may express aspects of class struggle, and see the possibility that states may act in ways that don't directly serve the interests either of particular fractions of capital or capital in general. So again, this isn't that you are that there's at least a possibility that the state can act in ways that aren't directly oriented towards the reproduction of capital in either the short or long term. So with these two sort of, again, stylized divisions, and then, after outlining these, I basically put them in conversation to explore the interaction between these positions. And here again, I looked at O'Connor. So James O'Connor, I think has developed this argument most thoroughly in terms of saying the state mediates capital in nature, such that conditions of capitalist production are politicized, and really emphasizes that we need to understand the state, the way that the state acts as an interface between capital and nature. So I, draw on this, say that the idea of how we think the state mediates between capital and nature is going to vary depending on how we view its relationship to nature, and B, its relationship to the state. So I ended up making a little 2x2 chart, which combines each of these two positions. So basically, putting each of the sort of a combination of each of these two positions together. So, for example, if you take the view that capitalism's relationship to nature is self-destructive, so capital destroys nature and therefore destroys its own conditions of production, and then you think that the state is, acts in the interest of capital. If you have a structuralist view of the state, then you would expect the state to step in to save capitalism from itself, but not to do, not to take actions that might also have, that aren't immediately oriented towards, stabilizing the conditions of accumulation, or, for example, that it's not also addressing, say, working class needs that are not immediately oriented towards accumulation. On the other hand, if we think capitalism is not self-destructive, if capitalism destroys nature but doesn't destroy itself, and we think take a structuralist view of the state, we would not expect the state to step in to prevent ecological destruction, because in this case, state action to prevent ecological crises, it's not saving capital from itself. It's action against capital. It's a limitation on its destructive tendencies undertaken in the interests of human and non-human life, but not its own interests. So I'm not going to go through all these. I know it's probably a little hard to follow all of the different pieces of the board, but so I have this little chart, and basically trying to break down basically in, again, a thematic and stylized way to give a rough guide for ways of thinking through the various possibilities we can imagine, and ways that different positions on how we view the state and how we view nature might what we might take in terms of what we would expect the sort of political possibilities to be, what kinds of action might be possible. So, whether we expect the state to, again, act to protect conditions of production, for example, undertaking carbon removal projects to permit fossil fuel companies to continue to extract and sell hydrocarbons, invest in the development of drought-resistant crops, which would, permit ongoing permit the production of crops even under drier and hotter conditions, but which might not be available to subsistence farming. Investing in certain forms of infrastructure that might protect economically significant industries while doing little to protect working class or racialized communities. Those are instances in which we would see the state preserving the conditions of production. But we might also, in other conditions, if we take more of the class struggle view, think that it's also possible to see, for example, forms of investment in, perhaps forms of extensions of public goods like housing and transit, defenses of land from extraction, and so on. So this is, it's a way of thinking through these different sorts of problems and possibilities, and to, I think, unearth especially some of the assumptions that I think are going into claims people make about the state, what it can do, what it might do. I'm not actually taking a position in the article as to why, sort of which quadrant or which combination of sort of state, capital, nature I think is most accurate, or sort of most, the one that we ought to sort of be using to think through things. Again, it's more of an exercise in clarification and trying to articulate some of the, I think, different terms that I think are often a bit muddied or sometimes collapsed within the space of debates around climate and environmental politics. The one thing I'll just sort of note in the end is that out of the configurations, we kind of end up having only one that predicts that the state will not only will not, but cannot act to effectively stave off ecological catastrophes, and also only one in which we would see state action to address ecological crises as sort of a genuine challenge to capital that might lay the groundwork for some more substantial, if not fully eco-socialist programs, at least more action in that direction. So, there are reasons to think, depending on, you might think one of those is more likely than the other, of course, but there are, at least we have a little bit more clarity on those. So there's a lot of things that the paper doesn't get into. I think I guess I'll just close by saying some of the things that I think are particularly pressing in terms of future thinking about the state. So one is thinking about what dimensions of, if we're thinking about something like a class struggle perspective on the state, what class struggles with respect to environmental issues are and might be. So thinking both about, and we've seen a lot in recent years on sort of the rise of green capital, some more attention to these kinds of fractions within capital. On the other hand, looking in more detail at how to conceptualize social forces that might generate struggle around the state. So, we often see social forces around environment described in terms of new social movements and counterposed to traditional sort of working class movements. And, I think we need to move beyond that. Second is obviously sort of thinking about the relationship of nationally bounded states in relation to sort of global capitalism and planetary ecological conditions, and thinking sort of across scales. And this is a place where, in general, I think we probably need to do a lot of reworking of contemporary, or sort of the legacy of state theory, which has rested on an implicit model of North American and European capitalist democracies. So this is a place where I think probably updating our state theory requires some amount of sort of reevaluating the degree to which that has been informed by this particular sort of conjunctural analysis of certain states. But in closing, I'll just say there's a lot more to do, but I will look forward to questions and comments. But I really, just want to just reiterate what I think of the importance of studying these terms together: state, capital, and nature, and in general, again, why I'm really grateful for this project. So thanks again to everyone, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'd like to turn it over to Nate now to discuss his chapter.
Great. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. I'm Nate. It's really lovely to be here with you all today. So basically, my chapter does two primary things. One is it lays out an analysis that's initiated by Engels and fleshed out further by Marx, that capitalism is a necessarily death-dealing system, and then it situates the capitalist state in relation to that analysis. So in his 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, Engels used the term social murder to name capitalism's tendency to kill, specifically through the ordinary, normal operations of social and economic life, which appears apolitical and taken for granted within the system. There's been a recent revival of this term, which dates from the Grenfell Tower fire in England in 2017. If you're not familiar with that, basically public housing residents were living in buildings wrapped in what was effectively napalm, and residents said for a very long time that this was unsafe and people were eventually going to die. That eventuality came out and a lot of poor people died. And that, in the response to that, and the movements in that and the analysis of that, produced a response which brought about more revival of the term social murder. I'm an example of that revival, having discovered it largely in response to the Tower fire. And I think that revival's gotten an even bigger boost. It's the wrong way to say it. That revival's gotten larger as people have been trying to make sense of the COVID pandemic starting in 2020. So part of what I argue in the chapter is that Engels' term is not just a rhetorical flourish, but is actually a theoretical analysis. And Engels kicks it off in 1845. Marx praises that book extensively in Volume 1 of Capital. And in the first and third volume of Capital, I argue Marx develops that analysis even more extensively. And so most of what my chapter does is not kind of trace the concept Marxologically, though I think that kind of work is very, very valuable. What it really tries to do is sort of lay out what I think is the core of that analysis as presented by Engels and Marx. And basically, every position that members of the proletariat inhabit within the circuits of capital in our society is a position where harms are very likely to be generated, or a little more strongly, harms will be generated at some point, but we don't always know at what point. So I'm going to flesh this out a little bit. As sellers of labor power, the work we do tends to harm our health in various ways. I think anyone with a job feels in some way, certainly anyone with a non-managerial job, feels that in some way work harms us, whether it's carpal tunnel, insomnia, or more severe physical ailments like silicosis, asbestosis, and so on. So in the production process, as our labor power is consumed, we are consumed. We're often also in unsafe environments. This is, again, the COVID pandemic has brought this home massively. There's a great deal of presence of disease within many people's workplaces. We've also discovered that indoor ventilation is pretty bad. There's high levels of CO2, et cetera, on a normal basis in many workplaces. And in even worse jobs than some of us have, things like exposure to electricity, exposure to excessive heat, dust, et cetera. So our lifetime spent in the production process is lifetime spent exposed to harmful waste products or conditions of the production process. Furthermore, the commodities we buy as means of subsistence tend to have harmful elements in them. These are periodically discovered in some kind of moral panic. And there's a regulatory push. We need to get rid of BPA in water bottles now. And the reason those harmful qualities exist in the means of subsistence in the first place is because our subsistence is simply not a priority. It's a secondary priority. It's a vehicle to commodities existing to valorize value. So there's a tendency then to produce goods as cheaply as possible, and if that hurts people, that harm will be found later and there will be a catching up process. So we should expect that some quantity of the means of subsistence just will hurt people because they're not fundamentally means of subsistence, they're fundamentally means of capital valorization, and subsistence is a secondary priority. Furthermore, the things that we need to live and thrive are often priced too high. Our wages can fall, so we can't always afford what we need, certainly not in the quality that we really need. And in addition, things that people need are not always produced. We have the technical capacity to cure certain diseases, but those cures are not produced in widespread enough quantities because, again, human need is not really a priority. In addition, research and development is not primarily directed toward human flourishing, it's directed toward profit. And so we have the technical capacity in the short term to develop greater cures, greater improvements to people's lives. But if it's not profitable, those developments won't happen. That won't become a priority. And so there's a short-term horizon where human suffering that could be alleviated, deaths that could be prevented in the relative short term, if that was a priority, it doesn't get prioritized. There's also a tendency for capitalism to generate structural unemployment. Marx discusses this in chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital, and the production of so-called surplus populations. And there's an ongoing tendency for economic crisis in capitalism, which tends to leave a lot of people suddenly without any money, which means access to means of subsistence is heavily crimped. In addition, the spaces in and around the physical locations where production happens tend to be polluted by waste from the production process. I live about 1.5 miles from a Firestone and Bridgestone tire factory. I don't love that. It's where we could afford to live. My kids breathe that shit in on a regular basis. There was also, we've had a recent raft of train derailments. Those trains pass through the living spaces of people. Those trains come off rails into the living spaces of people. And when they're carrying toxic shit, that toxic shit goes up into the atmosphere, into the living spaces of people. A little more theoretically, the waste of production reshapes the non-human natural world in ways that make that world less hospitable and often actively harmful. Again, in the case of pollution, I think we can see this in the case of climate change generated storms and so on. We also know now that the commodification of nature makes pandemic disease more likely. COVID pandemic is a good example. The zoonotic transmission from animals into humans of a novel pathogen. There's also huge risks of this with factory farming. And we've known since Engels' day that the conditions of life in workplaces and in crowded housing tend to foster the spread of disease. So in general, we live in a society where ills like silicosis, asbestosis, black lung disease, carpal tunnel, pandemic disease, and so on, these are all recurring parts of the social world, and they're apparently surprising when they're initially encountered, but they actually make a great deal of sense given the system's logic. So what my chapter tries to do is lay out that analysis in more detail, rooting it in Engels and especially in Marx and Marx's analysis in the first and third volumes of Capital. One other point that the chapter makes in relation to that general analysis is that capitalist social relations in general they don't appear in their generality. They appear in particularized concrete contexts, and those contexts change dynamically. I did some research early on into industrial accidents in steam laundries. Steam laundries still exist, but they don't exist as often as they used to. So in one sense, dynamically, the patterns of harms in steam laundries have gone away. On the other hand, what's really happening in the changes in the capital system are much more changes to continue. They're the unfolding of capital's logic. A lot of the changes that happen are capital's logic forcing a change in order to keep up with that logic. So it's more like a logic of continuity through dynamism rather than a change into genuinely novel social contexts. Now, this is only apparent for people who have a Marxist analysis. Because if you don't have a Marxist analysis, these kinds of problems can seem like just a set of contingent local problems that we'll deal with through their contingent causes in their local site of expression. Now, that's really important to deal with, and there are contingencies, but the contingencies are localized. What those local problems and local contingencies express are the fundamental tendencies of the system, and without a Marxist analysis, we won't see that continuity and the roots of these problems in the fundamental relationships of capitalist society. So part of the force of the analysis, why Engels and Marx, whether working matters, is to show that what can appear as disconnected phenomena, black lung disease sufferers, people in Ohio who can't go to their homes because of toxic waste, the opioid epidemic, COVID, those can seem like they have nothing connecting them when they are in fact all harms generated by the system. And if we have the analysis, we can start to perceive that and act on that connection. The other thing my chapter does is to try to discuss, is to get into place the analysis that I just sketched out in relationship to the capitalist state. Briefly, the state encourages this tendency for struggles against social murder to begin as particularized by treating those struggles as discrete, siloed affairs. We'll set up a fund for victims of black lung disease. We'll allow a lawsuit around asbestosis. We'll have a fund and some experts to deal with toxins in groundwater, etc. The other thing that the state does through both repressive and ideological means is to press these struggles to not get too militant, don't get too disruptive of capital accumulation. That tends to lower the ceiling on those particular struggles' ability to win. It also encourages system compatibility, and it prevents a knitting together of struggles. I argue, and here I'm not particularly original, I'm borrowing from other folks, Tony Smith, Alan Meiksons Woods, Simon Clark in particular, that capitalism in general is characterized by a basic division between a domain of society that appears as apolitical, namely the economy, and a domain that appears as political, namely the state. Now, in reality, economic life is deeply political. People make decisions about production. People tell other people what to do. Punishments happen. The cooperation happens. Those are all political phenomena by any rational definition of politics, but they seem depoliticized, and they occur in a privatized sort of fashion. By the same token, the state is presented as a domain where politics happen, but a huge priority for state-centered politics, for state institutions, is in fact to maintain the separation between state and economy and maintain the apparent depoliticization of social relations, particularly in the economy, that characterize capital society. So the state is as much an institution for fostering depoliticization as it is a terrain of meaningful politics. Now, all social struggles, including struggles over social murder, are eruptions of politics that challenge or have the potential to challenge this division between politics and apolitical social life. The state tends to channel those struggles in ways that constrain the scope of politicization, and it does so because the state has to leave capitalism's basic logic intact. So one result of all of this is that even when struggles over a specific form of social murder are successful, there's the example of the English Factory Acts that Marx discusses at length in Volume 1 of Capital. Those struggles won. They lowered working hours in England, which was terribly important in the lives of the people involved in those struggles. People were no longer worked to death by sheer duration. And the result was introduction of new industrial technology and a shift, Marx discusses this in Volume 3 of Capital, to people being worked to death by being torn apart by industrial machinery. So while the immediate conflicts over social murder are literally life and death, and I want to be very clear, I take this very seriously. I'm aware that as an academic, it can seem like I'm not sensitive to that. I very much am. It's literally life and death for people who have real skin in the game, sometimes literally skin in the game. But the broader systemic tendency is that a victory against a specific instantiation of the tendency to social murder is that social murder gets reorganized and moved around, rather than actually the tendency being mitigated, let alone ended. So one result of all this, I'll wrap up in just a moment, the state is fundamentally an accomplice to capitalism's tendency to social murder. It's basically the good cop to the economy's bad cop. So this has a few political takeaways to my mind, which is while reforms can be genuinely life or death for some actual people, and that really matters, and that's a hard political problem that we have to be able to answer, nevertheless, those reforms are not a substitute for revolution. The state tends to pressure us to think that it's such a substitute. Furthermore, we should see reformers from above, people in political power, as basically enemies of the working class and accomplices to social murder, even if they don't realize that's what they are. We should see reformers from below, popular movements that are seeking reform, as sincere efforts to deal with the problem, but as efforts that lack a Marxist analysis and who need to be won over to a Marxist analysis and a revolutionary anti-capitalist perspective. If we don't do that, as the system continues, real people will die. Those are the stakes of the system's continuing existence. Thanks. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Nate. And now finally, we will turn to Chris O'Kane for his chapter.
Well, thanks, everyone. Hard to top the last closing send-off of Nate's talk, but I'm going to try and transition to my subject anyway. And my chapter, which is entitled The Marx Revival in State Theory Towards a Negative Dialectical Critical Social Theory of the State. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about, sort of the framework behind it and the intention behind it, try and go through the argument a little bit, and, focus, I think, on the conclusion. And I just want to begin by saying that the chapter is sort of, it's intended as a sort of a self-reflection on, the Marx revival, on, what people have called the new left. And it's also intended to, contribute to, this debate on state theory within, or I guess coming out of the Marx revival. And for that reason, the chapter is like an intervention, or perhaps we might even say a provocation. And it's really intended for sort of a general audience, of people who are sort of interested in these matters, which is why I'm sort of so happy today to be here to talk to it about all of you. And just to give you an idea of sort of the general structure and approach of the chapter, I'm just going to read the abstract, which says that the chapter sort of brings critical state theory into the Marx revival by developing, what I call a negative dialectical critique of the state's role in the reproduction of capitalist society, which is conceived of as a negative totality. And to do this, it draws together Horkheimer and Adorno's work, and people from the critique of political economy as a critical social theory, or figures in the schools that Rob Hunter already mentions, the Neue Marxlektura, open Marxism. And before I get to this, I also try to sort of offer, a critique, and perhaps admittedly what might be a too condensed of a fashion of what I see as sort of the two most popular approaches to the state in the Marx revival. And I try and argue that they are sort of like one-sided and inadequate, and that in some ways they surprisingly sort of reflect each other in terms of antitheses. And then I move to sort of showing how I draw together the Frankfurt School and the critique of political economy as a critical theory. And then I move into sort of outlining sort of how I see the state as, this integral factor in capitalist society as a negative totality by developing, a critique of the state's role in the reproduction of capitalist society envisioned in such a manner. And I'm not going to focus on sort of the middle part, where I provide sort of this history of how I think the Frankfurt School relates to open Marxism, to the Neue Marxlektura. I think that's probably a little too inside baseball. And if people are interested in it, we can discuss it in the Q&A. So instead, I'm just going to focus on the first part, where I sort of lay out, what I see as these predominant approaches to state theory in the Marx revival, and, sort of their foreshortened accounts of the state. And then I'm going to try and provide an overview of my sort of provisional thinking about how the state fits into capitalist society in this negative manner. And I think before I turn to sort of outlining these two approaches, again, I want to stress that what I'm trying to do here is sort of provide what I think is like an interpretation of what people have of these different theories in terms of like general tendencies within the current left or the new left, rather than providing sort of a comprehensive analysis or exegesis of sort of the particular writers or thinkers in this tendency who are sort of far more complex and sophisticated than the sort of summary that I provide here. So the first approach within Marx revival state theory is what I call the revolutionary crisis theory of the state. And I argue that sort of this notion of the state is based on sort of popular interpretations of endnotes of Paul Maddock Jr., and it was sort of predominant right around 2008 to 2010. And this sort of analysis, I argue, focused on the crisis tendency of capitalism. It focused on the uprisings of the movement of the squares that was going on at the time. And to the extent that it focused on the state, it was really sort of a critique of the state's like inability to counteract crisis, to return to growth. And I think, within the past few months, to some extent, in a way, it seems like this debate has reemerged. And I argue sort of later on, the revolutionary crisis theory of the state was sort of supplanted by what I call the democratic socialist theory of the state. And this approach sort of draws on the work of Poulantzas, of Off, of Polanyi, of Gramsci, and it sort of conceives of capitalism at more of a conjunctural level in terms of a crisis of neoliberalism, and conceives of the state in terms of sort of a strategy of a democratic road to socialism that aspires to build collective power, collective dual power, and sort of tip the balance of class forces from the capitalist class to the working class, culminating in the collective democratic socialist rule of the state. So like I said, what I then attempt to do is sort of show the one-sided or foreshortened understanding of the state that both of these approaches have. And to do that, I'm just going to sort of read the conclusion that I have. And what I say there is that the democratic socialist state theory and the revolutionary crisis theory of the state are antithetical to one another. The revolutionary economic criticism of the state's inability to counteract capitalism's secular crisis, as opposed to a political theory of using the state to overcome the conjunctural crisis of neoliberalism and build democratic socialism. Hence, a theory of the immediate revolutionary self-abolition of the proletariat and the communization of society is opposed by a theory of building class power and the long march through institutions. Both of these approaches certainly have merit, and many of the thinkers who have developed these ideas have also made the foremost contributions to the Marx revival. Yet their shared purpose for theorizing the state, emancipatory strategy in a time of crisis, means that both of these theories are unsatisfying when it comes to critically understanding the role the state plays in the reproduction of capitalist society. For despite their antithetical precepts, these two prevalent approaches to state theory are both premised on an approach to the state from the perspective of an emancipatory dynamic, coupled with an unexamined theory of needs that abstracts the state from the reproduction of capitalist society. For the revolutionary crisis theory of the state, the secular economic crisis not only serves as the basis of its criticisms of the inability of the state to counteract the crisis, The historical trajectory of the secular crisis also increasingly displaces laborers from the wage relation, leading to the necessity of revolutionary uprisings that communize reproduction for people to meet their material needs. Conversely, in the democratic socialist state theory's conception of the democratic road to socialism, the shifting balance of class forces will use the state to implement redistributive programs that will minimize exploitation and build public power. This will meet people's needs, strengthening the political will of the masses for socialism, which will be realized in a progressive historical trajectory that further shifts the balance of class forces, public power, and redistribution. Such a conjunctural historical trajectory will be realized in democratic socialism. Consequently, I argue neither of these approaches consider how the economy, state, classes, or needs are created by the historically specific form of capitalist society, or how the state's expansive powers are an integral moment in the reproduction of the historically specific form of society. So then in the next section, I sort of try to outline this relationship. And my inspiration is this line that Adorno has in one of his lectures about how contemporary society is the negative unity of unfreedom. So I try and show how capitalist society, in terms of the relationship between the economy, the household, and the states, form this unity of unfreedom. And I begin by sort of arguing that such a unity of unfreedom is historically specific insofar as it is premised on unity and separation, of the producers from the means of production, and as a result, the constitution of the autonomized forms of capitalist society. And then I move into each of these domains. I begin with sort of a synopsis of the economy, and here I focus on, how the dynamic of a capital accumulation is inherently crisis-ridden, and how it is centered on an antagonistic form of class struggle between personifications of capital and doubly free laborers who only have their labor power to sell, and how such a dynamic is realized in the sort of things that Nate already talked about, or what Marx terms the martyrology of the producer, I believe in Capital Volume 1. Then I move to the household, where I argue that household labor and social reproductive activity also contribute to the reproduction of capitalist society. They are, based on inherent to private property, to atomization, and to competition, and the activity of domestic labor sustains private households and the commodity of labor power, and can thus be seen in terms of the martyrology of reproductive labor. Then I move to the state, where I focus on how the state mediates and reinforces the economy and household. In order to do so, I sort of critique the form of the state as an entity that, as previous presenters have described, as separate from but related to the economy, but also to the household. And on this basis, I try to sort of illuminate how the form of the capitalist state and its administrative capacities perpetuate capitalist society, both in terms of perpetuating the constitutive basis of unity and separation, but also by reproducing and perpetuating these other spheres through property, through the form of law, which treats people from different classes as abstract citizens, through the separation of the economic and the political, and what Johannes Agnoli calls the statification of the political, insofar as political, class struggle demands are translated into political demands, which are then absorbed and depoliticized by the state and transformed into bureaucracy, moving to a critique of how Keynesian and monetarist policies both do this in different ways, and then to a critique of policing as sort of the more overtly violent form of state, the more violent form of state violence, which likewise contributes to such a dynamic. And then I conclude. And like I said, I think I'll just read the conclusion as a way of my conclusion. The contemporary revival of Marxist theory has led to the development of two predominant approaches to state theory. The crisis theory of the state focuses on criticizing the state's inability to counteract the unfolding secular crisis of capitalism. The democratic socialist theory of the state conceives of the state as an object of socialist strategy. On this basis, the crisis theory of the state criticizes reformism as an impossibility and advocates for revolutionary immediacy, while democratic socialist state theory advances non-reformist reforms as part of the process of building class power on the revolutionary road to socialism. Despite these merits, these mutually antithetical approaches offer foreshortened notions of the role of the state and the reproduction of capitalist society. This chapter has attempted to clarify these shortcomings by developing a negative dialectical critique of the form and capacities and role of the state in the reproduction of capitalist society as a negative totality. In contrast to the revolutionary crisis and democratic socialist theories, according to the negative dialectical critical theory of the state, it is not a question of conceiving of what role the state plays in relation to the economy, nor of secular crisis, nor the balance of class forces. Rather, it is a question of conceiving of the economy, class, and state as moments in the reproduction of the historically specific negative totality of capitalist society in order to demonstrate the negative unity of society and its overall unfreedom, and the suffering and misery that results from its historically specific antagonistic organization of society. Consequently, contra the revolutionary crisis theory of the state, the negative dialectical critique of the state does not underestimate the state on the basis of the reified dynamic of secular crisis, nor does it assume that once people's needs are not being met, they will rise up. Instead, the negative dialectical critique of the state holds that even if there is a secular crisis that cannot be counteracted by state fiscal and monetary policy, leading to spontaneous revolutionary uprisings, that such a revolutionary crisis theory passes over the other elements of the state and subjectivity, notably policing, law, the military, and education, integral to reproducing the historically specific form of capitalist society. At the same time, in distinction to the democratic socialist theory of the state, even if the conjunctural analyses of democratic socialist state theory were to prove right, and a wave of elections resulted in a shift of the balance of class forces in the terrain of the state and redistributive policies, the negative dialectical social critique of the state holds that democratic socialist state theory does not address the form of the state nor its role in depoliticization. Following Agnoli, the negative dialectical critique of the state holds that, quote, state institutions do not allow themselves to be used in any manner whatsoever, for their logic is not their own, but is determined by the reality whose functioning they serve. State institutions are not there to realize either freedom or human rights, not to mention social emancipation. Rather, they have solely the responsibility of organizing and securing the social reproduction of a capitalist society. Consequently, following Clark, redistributive state policies do not then either build public power or the public will for class struggle. Instead, they create bureaucratic agencies that undermine workers' autonomy and depoliticize class struggle. Hence, following and adapting Horkheimer, quote, numerous unsavory activities are required if society is to be held together, including the maintenance of prisons and the production of murderous weapons. Moreover, as Horkheimer further notes, the way the police occasionally treat the workers during uprising or beat the imprisoned unemployed with the butts of their rifles, the tone the factory porter uses with the man looking for work, the workhouse, and the penitentiary, all these functions as the limits that disclose the space in which we live. And I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you to all three of our contributors for their presentations. And before we move on to the discussion portion of the afternoon, I just wanted to ask if Rafael or Eva had any brief comments that they wanted to share, and then we will hear from Fred Murphy from the Marxist Education Project.
I will pass on any comments for the time being.
Likewise, I'm very happy to hear from the audience if they have questions. I'm going to thank everyone for this event and our contributors. It's been really great listening to you all.
Okay, thank you, Fred.
Okay, so again, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the Zoom chat, and Steve and I will keep an eye on that, try to consolidate questions that are similar, and pass them on to the panel. And if there are, substantive comments that you'd like to make, we'll take that into consideration and call on you for those. So please, everyone, type in the chat whatever questions or comments you'd like to make, and you can start doing that now. Meantime, I will just pass it over to Steve Backman, also of the Marxist Education Project, to just say a few words about the MEP and its activities and so on. So, Steve, you're muted.
Thanks, and thanks to our panel and the editors of the book for great presentations. And I'm really looking forward to reading the whole book, having read the introduction already. Since it seems like many of you are new to the MEP, so I just wanted to say a couple things, a minute or two. The Marxist Education Project has existed under different names now for almost 50 years in New York. And it is, so neither Fred or I were there at the beginning, and I'll just say in my own interpretation, it started as an independent adult education program of sorts, but specifically to introduce and to support people in the movement who wanted to have better grounding in Marxism and in modern critiques, extensions of Marxism. But the core of it from the beginning was reading year after year all three volumes of Capital and related core texts from Marx. Today's event is a typical thing that we really like to do, which is to introduce new books, new themes, new authors, and kind of a book launch event, but special to this audience, not like going to Barnes and Nobles. And then we also have ongoing book groups that meet for 10 or so weeks. Sometimes a theme from a talk like this will generate interest in reading the book together, and that could easily happen. And then sometimes books that we read stimulate the idea of finding the authors and having them come. And we would welcome anybody here to visit the website, which we'll put in the chat, although you must have known since you registered, to take a class or to talk to Fred and I if you want to propose something to us to lead. And that's really all I wanted to say. And again, we're so happy to have both our panel and you all here with us this afternoon. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rob. And Rob, you and your folks will lead the discussion, but in the background, Fred and I will be helping to collect the people who either just want to have a comment read or a question or do want a chance to speak.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you again to the Marxist Education Project for making this event possible. This is great, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. I want to give people just a few more moments to have the chance to come up with their questions and to enter them into the chat. Please do so. But Eva, it looked like you had something to say.
Just all raise hands if they want to. We will allow,
Right.
yeah.
But the questions are starting to flow into the chat. So we have one already. Nope, never mind. Okay. We have a bundle of questions now. So let's begin with the first one, which was prompted by Chris's presentation. I want to ask, is there a prospect where the crisis theory, specifically the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, can be used to explain the periodization of the capitalist state? I think that this was originally envisioned by Joachim Hirsch, but never developed. And Chris, I am going to put you on the spot since this is directly pertinent to your presentation, and then others can chime in as well.
Thanks for the question. I would say that, not only can such a theory be used to periodize the capitalist state, but I think that was sort of implicit to some degree in some of the revolutionary crisis theories of the state that I discussed. Maybe Maddock Jr. And people like that don't do it overtly, but you could say that it is sort of part of an at least implicit periodization that is tied in with the impossibility of reviving Keynesianism, the end of the workers' movement. So I guess my answer to that would be that if it hasn't explicitly happened, I think it has implicitly happened. I don't know what the others have to say.
I'll jump in briefly. So I think that crisis theory is incredibly important for periodizing changes in the capitalist state. I think that people also, and I think Chris brought this out really well, people don't necessarily agree on what the crisis theories that we have are, though. And so that different crisis theories periodize the state in different ways. I'm very partial to Simon Clark's work, who I will say Chris told me for about 10 years to read, and it took me about 8 to get to it, and Rob as well. So my own thoughts on this are shaped by people who I'm in the room with here. But Simon Clark, his book, Keynesianism, Monetarism, and the Crisis of the State, is precisely a periodization of the capital state in Britain using crisis theory, and furthermore developing crisis theory out of that. But for Clark, the crisis is not due to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It's a related and complicated, different account of crisis theory. Some of it feels above my pay grade. I'm not sure I understand all of it. To the degree that I do, I agree with that, and I'm not sure that the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is the primary driver of crisis in a capitalist society. For people who are not Marxists, I think that kind of debate sometimes feels like, oh, how many angels are on the head of a pin? But I think actually these sort of deep theoretical questions that are an abstraction from social reality are in fact profoundly important to work through together, because we have to understand social reality, and these concepts are part of the mechanism through which we do so. And so I think the condition where, like I said, a lot of people periodize the state through crisis theory, but people don't have a shared, Marxists don't always have a shared crisis theory, and I think that's fine. Marxism is fundamentally a tradition of contention together. I think the problem is when we have different crisis theories that people don't realize are different crisis theories. And I think, again, Chris's work is really great in drawing out that there are, in fact, people on the left who have different views, and we need to draw out those differences so that then they can be placed more in debate.
All right, does anyone else want to touch on this first question? I'll just add one thing, and with apologies, I don't want to tax everyone's patience, but I will join the Chris and Nate chorus of name checking Simon Clark, who has a great essay on the periodization of the state in a volume called Open Marxism, Volume 1. And he pushes back against the idea of trying to do too much with the idea of using a periodization of the state as an argument about the state's form or about the state's activity and how it relates to or facilitates capital production. So this is I'm anticipating one of the questions further down the stack, which I love. It's because it's going to put us all in the hot seat. In terms of Alyssa's 2x2 grid, I think it's safe to say that Clark's view is a relatively structural one in the sense of the term that Alyssa uses, pushing against the idea that there are profound shifts either in state capacities or the tractability for the state for emancipatory purposes, given apparent shifts in accumulation. So among other things, Clark's argument, and he also has a book called Marx's Theory of Crisis, which I highly recommend. His argument is that crises are important to understanding both capital and the capitalist state, but that it's explicitly in a rejection of the idea that there are distinct regimes of accumulation, such that there are incommensurable logics from one period to the next in terms of how capital is accumulated and how the state goes about being a moment in the capital accumulation. I have to confess it's been a very long time since I read Hirsch. I know that he wrote an essay about this, I believe, in the volume State and Capital. But anyway, I should stop there. And unless any of the other panelists want to weigh in, we do have additional questions to talk about. So our next question is a twofer. So first, quote, given the old argument that Poulantzas, et cetera, don't provide space to analyze concrete institutions, where do you situate the concrete history of governmental institutions in your analysis? If the state is a terrain of class struggle, then how does that help us to understand concrete governmental departments? I'm going to read the second part as well. Thinking of, say, the US state, the question of state is inseparable from the question of empire. And I think while, for instance, a lot of historical sociologists have written a lot on empire in recent years, sometimes Marxists still focus on the state without unpacking the state-empire relationship. Curious if you all have any thoughts on this. So I propose that we make either or both prongs of this question available for discussion. They're not unrelated, but they are distinct.
I could try to speak to that question if none of our panelists have any immediate thoughts. I think that this is a good question because it captures, I think, some of the perception of Poulantzas' work that was initially received into Anglophone academia and these Marxist state debates as excessively abstract and excessively structural and functionalist. So he's very good at kind of speaking at this higher degree of abstraction about the role of the capitalist state within the capitalist mode of production, but less good in terms of articulating, let's say, concrete, conjunctural analyses of particular state forms. I think he became more aware of that in his later work, and actually, I think wrote some things to try to modify that. But to speak to the question of how does this, if the state is a terrain of class struggle, how does that help us understand concrete governmental departments? Um, my immediate thought would be that in some ways this actually connects to the question of empire and imperialism as well, because you're able to trace the different phases of capitalism or different stages of capitalism from, let's say, a 19th century form of commercial capitalism, and prior to them, even a kind of the earlier modes of imperialism that existed, let's say, when we speak of the Spanish Empire compared to, let's say, the English Empire, and the different ways that resource extraction and labor coercion kind of factored into these different forms. But then in the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, you have the switch to monopoly capitalism, which for Poulantzas immediately already makes it possible to distinguish between two different kinds of state forms, one being a kind of liberal capitalism that that condenses in the form of the parliamentary republican state with a division of powers within a constitutional framework, kind of like what we associate as the normal form of the bourgeois state. And then there's the exceptional state, under which he categorizes Bonapartism, fascism, primarily. Those are kind of like the two main variants. So already then that gives you some, I think, conceptual leverage to try to then assess more particular ways that class struggles will resonate with government institutions. So just to give you an example, military dictatorship being the one other form of the exceptional state that I forgot to mention a moment ago. But fascism and military dictatorship, for example, have different relationships to the masses, right? So military dictatorship primarily seeks to repress the political opposition, repress the political sphere in any kind of in any kind of meaningful sense, whereas fascism actually relies on the mass party, which is a specific kind of political apparatus that isn't really present in military dictatorship. So it has a different relationship to the way that it tries to modify and channel the class struggle towards a different kind of hegemonic project. I think the one potential upshot of this in terms of how it connects revolutionary strategy and class struggle to the institutions of the capitalist state is that it would be quite foolish to try to, let's say, occupy the state in this piecemeal fashion, where you can just kind of say, well, only if, let's say, socialists can just get a majority in parliament or any kind of representative institution, that will then allow us to then implement certain reforms that will then, let's say, push the other branches of the state to, act accordingly with democratic socialist wishes. Or the flip side would be you could try to control the judiciary or the executive, but in any case, you can't kind of tackle the state in this piecemeal fashion, because the capitalist state has a way of kind of modifying the locus or the node of class power, where that class power is concentrated, to a different apparatus or a different institution. So socialist, let's say, advances in representative politics will then push capitalists to adopt, let's say, more repressive means, where actually then they do become more reliant on the police or on the military to try to adjust to this changing terrain. So where this leaves us is this theoretical takeaway that class struggles do matter for how state institutions operate, but they don't matter in a kind of direct and unmediated sense. Rather, they're always kind of at a secondary or tertiary level to where to what form and mode the state takes. They're there, and they kind of factor into the overall into the state's overall ability to kind of maintain a hegemonic project and maintain a certain, you could say, equilibrium of forces, but they very rarely have a kind of unmediated, immediate effect on what the state can or can't do. I'm going to leave the question of imperialism, though, to somebody else who's probably more qualified to speak of that.
Well, I think that a couple of panelists, other panelists also want to address that question, but I'm going to read another one that I think is directly related, and perhaps we can try to address them both. So this one was just posted in the chat. How should we understand the relationship between states? For example, is it a competitive struggle between national capitals for economic hegemony, a collaborative relationship to secure the reproduction of capitalism as a whole, or both? How do you view these relationships? So let me suggest that we treat that as asking a similar sort of question to the question about empire. And I will just briefly say that in response to the two questions about concrete institutions and empire, Mike McCarthy's chapter in the volume sort of directly addresses that first one of dealing with concretion and abstraction. And then the second question about empire, Steve Meyer and Scott Aquano's chapter is not really about empire, but it is about global hegemony and about the contradictory role that is played by U.S. domestic institutions in international networks of financial flows and the movement of capital. And I don't want to speak too much on their behalf about their claims, but that these are the sorts of themes. These are themes that we try to touch on in the volume. And I believe at least Eva also had something to say.
Yes, unless one of our other panelists want to go first. I don't know. No? You okay? I'll just say a couple of very brief comments because it's a very, very interesting question. I mean, first, to just say that in the conclusion, we close by offering some suggestions as to future directions of research. And one of them is precisely the question of the relationship between theories of imperialism and theories of the capitalist states. And there is already some work that's suggestive of the importance of bringing the states back to our understanding and our development of theories of imperialism. And we gesture there to the fact that we believe this relationship should go both ways, in that theories of imperialism should also begin to inform our theories of the capitalist states. Now, just as a very brief suggestive comment, because it's not something I've worked extensively on myself, but I think we have already the seeds of that kind of approach in Capital itself. When Marx analyzes capitalism in Volume 1 and proceeds to examine some of its historical concretizations later on in the same volume, he speaks, of course, of primitive accumulations in the colonies. He's quite clear about the fact that what kickstarted the process of capital accumulation in England in particular was as a result of processes that happened abroad in the colonies. And in that, I would say that actually, for me at least, one first step will be not to unpack the state-empire relationship, but at least historically, to come to terms with the fact that the first capitalist states, and by first capitalist states, I mean those states that were recognized as sovereign states, not the colonies, were actually always, from their inception, empire states. Like the empire was, in a way, a specific social form, a specific legal concretization of the capitalist state during its genesis. So I think we have the seeds there. Then I would also say a few things that obviously even Poulantzas works, for example, on the EU and European integration, was always very attentive to how imperialism changed in its form and also how it impacted the role of the capitalist states itself, and how the capitalist state also was restructured from within as a result of imperialism and the specific form that it takes at the international level. So we have a lot of resources within the state debate to begin and address this question a little bit more systematically, I believe. Now, to connect it also to the very last question, is it a competitive struggle between national capitals or a collaborative relationship, etc.? I think already implicit. But first, I'll say that actually the problem again is that, as Nate said earlier, we have various theories of crisis, where we have very many different theories of imperialism and of the international. And of course, how we would understand the relationship between states very much depends on how we understand the international sphere. And you have things like dependency theory, world system theories, other theories that might conceptualize that differently. I think what's important to bear in mind, at least, is that there is, on the one hand, sort of what we call the logic of capital, that some have called, which is sort of a general tendency of capitalism to unify the globe, to create a global social totality. And there, it's not just about competition or collaboration between sort of major national capitals, but we also have to take into account competitive struggles within core capitalist imperialist states, and also the inequalities that arise from the global division of labor, because not every state is equally positioned within the global state system. So I don't think we can capture the relationship between states by an either or. I think we need to have a much more holistic understanding of the international to understand how each capitalist state fits within that totality. So these are a very tentative preliminary thoughts, but this is all to say that as part of the revival of the state debate, I think this entails a revival of these very questions and directions that we hope to open and that become more and more urgent, as, for example, even for Alyssa's work on the ecological crisis. Of course, these all come together. There's no one state that will deal with the ecological crisis anyway. So thank you for raising them. And it's exactly the sort of debate we hope our book will engender, and we hope to be then able to develop thematically in different forums with different kinds of people as well. Thank you.
Go for it, Nate.
So I wanted to jump in on this question as well, on the how should we conceptualize the relationship between states? And I should say at the outset, so my training is largely as a U.S. historian, which there's a kind of unfortunate methodological nationalism. So it takes work for me to think. It's not ready to hand as an immediate instinct, which part of why I find is interesting. So it takes work for me to think outside of a single state as the unit of reference rather than a system of states. But I would say, so the question was, Ryan's question was, is it a competitive struggle or a collaborative relationship, or both? And I would say both. And there's a quote, it's an Adorno quote that I'm sure I heard from Chris, I'm sure I heard from Chris, because it's where I get all the Adorno from. It's that capitalism maintains itself not despite conflict, but because of conflict. And I don't mean this flippantly. As an analogy, in my 20s, I would occasionally find myself in bars where a couple of guys would get into a bar fight. That's a male-dominated space, but it's a male-dominated space that takes the form of a conflict between a few men. And in my own industry, my own workplace right now, we're having budget cuts because of enrollment shortages. And so the control that my employer exerts over employees and the cuts that are happening is precisely through the form of the competitive conflict between my employer and other employers. And so I think this pattern of and you can think about, and I don't know a lot about this history, but think about early modern Europe, where all of the royals are related and they're also engaging in these fratricidal wars. And so there are forms of rule over subordinates where the rulers themselves may hate each other and want to kill each other, but their conflicts occur in a way that create a relatively stable pattern of rule over their social subordinates. And so I would say, that it's both, that states are fighting with each other, and capitalists are competing and fighting with each other and so on. And so that the conflicts between social actors are the form that capitalism's reproduction as a whole takes, would be how I would put that.
So in the interest of making sure that as many questions get a hearing as possible, I'm going to suggest that we move on. I'm going to skip for now the question of how do Nate and Chris fit into Alyssa's quadrant, because I'm going to amplify it. And I'm going to take some of the pressure off of Alyssa. And instead, we all have to place ourselves in the quadrant at the end of the conversation. So get ready. So going down the queue, I'm going to try to hit as many questions as I can, but because we already started talking about Poulantzas, I want to refer to a question that says, how does Poulantzas's later work bridge the relative autonomy and social form approaches to the state? And as the question asker points out, this is a claim that Eva, Rafael, and I make in the introduction to the volume. I invite everyone to chime in on this if they have thoughts. I'm happy to go first. I'm not our resident Poulantzas expert, but I want to emphasize one way in particular that I think that his last work, State Power Socialism, it's speaking in a very different register and drawing upon a different repertoire of terms and to a certain extent concepts. But I think it's given expression to similar intuitions that are expressed in many social form theories because, among other things, he pays a lot of attention to state violence and the politically constitutive role of violence. Which is something that Chris touched on in his presentation as well. And the violence, in the terms from Chris's presentation, for example, the violence of the state is form determined. It's not something that occurs at the whim of particular state personnel or in furtherance of their personal interests, but it actually is an appearance of what the state is and what it can only be, or what it can't help being. And this is something that Poulantzas explores in State Power Socialism as well, and he has some great turns of phrase for talking about state violence in this way. And that seems to me, at least, to be rather different from the conception of the state that he offered during his earlier debates with Miliband, for instance, and also in earlier pieces where he's talking about the state simply as a condensation. I'm not going to get the exact phrase right. Material condensation of the balance of forces or something like that, as where the state is almost a reflection of a particular synchronic image of the state of play in class struggle at a given moment. He moves away from that somewhat in State Power Socialism, which unfortunately was his last book. Anyone else have anything to say on this question?
I just want to jump in quickly to kind of confirm what Rob just said. I think State Power Socialism is a really interesting text for trying to bridge what we kind of see as these two dominant strands within Marxist theorizations of the state today that, for whatever reasons, have not spoken to each other very much because of the historical and social context in which they've developed. But I think it's also important to recall that in that book, he explicitly says that he's trying to kind of theorize the capitalist state from this perspective of the division between manual and intellectual labor, and specifically of how the capitalist state reproduces that distinction as a way of then perpetuating its own social power and its own rule. So if we think of what does this entail, I mean, this obviously entails the ongoing dispossession of people from their means of production, but on a more kind of level of the state, it entails the generation and reproduction of law and of legal categories, legal terms, of the bureaucracy as a specific language that is only spoken by a small exclusive number of people. Economic language, the language of technocracy that again is really impermeable to many people. And also, of course, then the means of violence and the kind of like repressive capacities of the state, as Rob mentioned. So I think in a way, there is substantially there's enough substance there to try to theorize the state as the overlap between these two approaches on the basis of the state's role in its own reproduction and in the various social practices by which it's reproduced. So if we kind of go down to the level of kind of maybe individual sort of day-to-day practices, we can see that there's a certain illusion of the autonomy of the political that social form theories speak of when they speak of capitalism as a system of a social totality, where the political or the state only appear as a kind of illusory moment of where they have independence. But it's actually, in a way, the reification of everyday sedimented social and class struggles that then produce that effect of the state as being independent. And I think I'm curious what other folks think about this, but I feel like that there's actually a lot of ground here if we start to take it from this perspective of social struggle and states, the division of between manual and intellectual labor as it's reinforced by the state, that maybe provides some window of an overlap there.
Okay, next question. If neither, so this was prompted by Chris's chapter or presentation. If neither the revolutionary conjunctural uprising nor the evolutionary democratic transition is adequate to confront the state power of the capitalist class, how and by whom will the power of capital over society as a whole be replaced? Just small stake stuff here.
Oh, well, yeah. Obviously, I have the answer to that question, and I've just been waiting until 9 minutes before the event ends to tell everyone. But I think, in all seriousness, this is along with the theory of the state, now more than ever, I think this is a question that we all need to confront. Because I don't think, maybe I'm being too pessimistic here, but I think. I don't think either approach was very successful. And I think we need to do some, long and hard thinking about, why that may have been the case and, what is next. And hopefully, what I write will have some sort of a contribution to it, but I'm certainly, not claiming to be a master theorist who has the answer. I think it's something that we all have to do collectively and collaboratively, and not just in terms of theory, but in terms of actual struggles. But I think one thing that I would say in relation to this question is I think one of the points that I would make is that I don't think it is a struggle of how and by whom the power of capital over society as a whole will be replaced, because I don't think the power of capital is separate from society, right? I think it is inherent to the way that society is organized, and if anyone, us or others, are going to overcome it, then it has to be through, transforming society as a whole, not thinking of capital as a separate entity that has power over society. And I think, I hope that, thinking about that and thinking about struggles in terms of, how do they transform society? How do they at least overcome this constitutive separation of people from each other, of people from the means of production, of the domination of external internal nature. How do we incorporate those theories into a theory of society alongside a theory of the state, and how do we sort of struggle to overcome society together? Would be sort of just the sort of general starting points that I have stumbled towards. Although I'm sorry that I do not have a more definitive answer. And I invite my co-panelists or other people in the audience, since I thought this was, going to be a general discussion as well, to, share their own perspectives on the matter.
I just want to amplify this question by reading another one in the stack that's very similar. For all panelists, what kind of short to medium-term practical work can be drawn from the book or these essays? How can people and movements use this book to improve our political ground game?
Hey, where are you going to go?
I don't have to. I mean, eventually, but if rock, paper, scissors for it. Do you want to go first, Alyssa?
I don't care.
So I guess I would say, Chris sort of said this. If it was easy and we knew how, it would have already been done. And I guess, to my mind, it's a question of organization, but I think an ecosystem of organizations, not a single organizational form. And so, one, and there's lots of facets as well, because struggles aren't fungible. People struggle over different things in different contexts that are rooted in capitalism, but are different expressions of concretely differing expressions of the ways capitalism manifests in our lives. And so that means some of the differences in forms of struggle are not incidental or accidental. They make sense in contexts. And so I don't think there's a kind of cookie cutter response. And this is not adequate, but I do think the kinds of efforts of the MEP of really actively saying people need theory and thought, and we need to make that independent of the university, not in the sense of, our university administrators don't call the shots and control that, and sort of creating like an independent, self-controlled, democratic adult education kind of program. I think that's one avenue, certainly not a sufficient one. We're not going to read books until capitalism collapses, but real study is an incredibly important part of that. So I think that'd be one element. And I guess I would also say, not trying to beg off the question, but social movements are forms of incredible intelligence that's collectively distributed, they're distributed and networked and so on. And so I would say, and all of us are products of that in various ways too here. And so I think feeding back what we've learned through our own individual study and the networks of intellectuals we're in and the network struggles we're part of into the movement. And then I think the hope is that the movement through uptake of ideas like this, and as one small element of that, and then its own experiences organized in processes of reflection, will sort of come up with those answers. I would also just say, really directly, my own proclivities lie toward the wage workplace and the labor movement, though not the existing official labor movement. I guess the other thing I would say is that I think a lot of the forward motion, Anton Pannekoek, I don't know how you say his name, Pannekoek, has this wonderful quote in a piece in 1936 called Party and Class, where he says, people want to think that we're going to get progress through unity, but in fact, the political progress of the proletariat is an ongoing process of breaks and conflicts, because these are hard problems. And so I think that would also be part of the forward motion here, is going to be tremendous contention. And again, Chris did this really well, and Alyssa did this as well, of laying out, here's a range of positions, and people do not agree. And the point is not so much to reach agreement, the point is to sharpen some of those conflicts so that we get smarter in ways that can feed back into movements collectively and learn from movements collectively.
All right, so before Alyssa goes next, I just want to say that we are approaching our official stop time, and we are appreciative of everyone who has stayed with us for the full 2 hours. And at least some of us will stick around for a little while longer and try and address as many questions as possible. So if you can, please stick around, and we'll try and cover all of the questions. But I think Alyssa and then Eva both want to speak on this point.
Yeah, thanks. And that's I think my point actually really picks up off of what Nate was saying in terms of, I think really what I was hoping to do in my chapter was to just expose a lot of the points of disagreement and places where I think people were not even like articulating these disagreements as such, where there were like underpinning theories of political programs, theories of change, whatever you want to call it, that were being described at, again, like more of a level of what should we do, and that I think rested on some like underlying ideas that I do think that that both the eco-Marxists and state theory traditions give us some resources to think through a little bit more in depth. So I hope again, like my paper doesn't say like this is the right one and this is what we should do, but I hope that for people who are engaged in these debates, it can be clarifying like, oh, is this what I think about the state? Is this what I think about like climate and or capitalism in nature? Like, what do I think that, there's a lot of other details to fill in, of course, because it's very at a, it is at quite an abstract level. And so there's like a lot of specifics, but hopefully at least just trying to think through what that would mean in terms of then like, okay, so now what do I think? Does that cause one to like reevaluate strategy, or like what one thinks like forces that are possible to mobilize or whatever it may be. So I think that that's sort of if not quite a thing directly from him, is hopefully it's something to like be a resource in some way. The other thing is that I think this maybe go back a little bit to the very challenging question posed to Chris, which I also don't have an answer to. But in addition to I really liked what you said, Chris. But I think and like the other thing that I think is also worth thinking about, at least for like my chapter, which is sort of and one of the ways that I often think about state theory, it's like it's what are sort of what are the ends, and not just to say like, oh, well, non-reformist reform sort of in some kind of vague way, but like I don't think that the only outcome of sort of engaging the state is necessarily like to I think as a question put it, to and it's like end capital's rule. With climate, it might be buying time. Like, and that is sometimes there are other legitimate things. Or Nate talked about like maybe there are reforms that are going to save people's lives, and they're not going to. Then it does not preclude the need for a revolution at some point, but there might be moments of sort of making strategic decisions about like recognizing the limits of what you're going to do through a particular kind of political program or project, and being okay with that, but just knowing what those are. And that I think is also helpful to sort of rather than saying like by doing X passing this bill or something, we're going to then that will be like the path to eco-socialism, to like say we're going to do this, and that's that's not, we don't necessarily expect XYZ to sort of follow from it, but to have some kind of just way of thinking through why we're kinds of organizing and acting in the way we are. So and I tend to be like I don't know, and that's a tough balance to pull up too, in terms of being like pragmatic about things like near term reforms, especially with things like climate urgency, without just kind of fully sinking into just a totally reformist position. But I think it's also one of the things that I think one of the conversations that I hope this volume can also like spark and help people engage with.
Thank you. Is it okay to go on, Rob?
Please.
Yeah, I'll try to be not too long. On the general question asked to Chris, and it will lead maybe to some of the practical takes that can be taken from the volume. I tend to think about these questions of revolution, and I try to do some of that in my chapter. I'll come to it in a second, in terms of maybe two broad questions. The temporality of revolution. How do we create revolutionary conditions rather than imagining that we necessarily have to, offer now the point of rupture? So I like to think of how we can sort of radicalize people, grow the movement. I think it's more helpful, particularly thinking that these two either or options have failed, to think of it in those terms. So how do we create the conditions for revolution, and who is the revolutionary subject is the second question. Now, how we create the conditions. For example, so in my chapter, as Rob said, I look at this war emergency paradigm. So the deployment of the war metaphor and the deployment of exceptional legal powers to address some crisis. And now, for example, I sort of, in the left, there's always been one side, and that's schematic, right? It's caricatural, but still, let's say that there's one side that always says, this is very reactionary, it normalizes executive power, it cuts down on the rights that, the social movements have gained, etc., etc. And indeed, if we look back at the history of the war metaphor and all of that, it has very often been used as a tool for counter-revolution and colonial domination. And on the other side, we have people that more recently have advocated for things like war communism, and that sort of there is this binary kind of between those positions. And what I try to do in my chapter is crisis like existential questions. And I try to think about how this terrain of war and emergency and the climate emergency, how we should position ourselves vis-a-vis those debates, and whether we should kind of, again, fall under an either or approach, whether we either reject that language and reject the exceptional powers, or we embrace them as the way to go. And I try to go back to Marx himself and to look at the ways in which he conceptualized the relationship between crisis, war, and revolution. And that is crucial then to how we understand the capitalist states. And I mean, my argument in that chapter, but I can't unfortunately cover more of it now, but was that we always, these are questions of tactics, not only strategy. And it will always be determined by the specificity of the moment, how best to react. In some cases, I think there would be a space for social movements, for example, to adopt the language of, the climate emergency, the appeal to exceptional powers, all of these things, if and when it contributes to creating the conditions for a collective consciousness that then can create revolutionary conditions and radicalization. And in that capacity, in that context as well, I call attention at the end of the chapter to maybe, alongside the revival of the capitalist state debate, maybe we also need a bit of a revival of military and strategic thinking in Marxism. Lenin, all those people that have thought a bit more concretely about theory and sort of concrete revolutionary struggles that were thinking about theories in terms of their concrete social basis. So that's one thing. The other thing about who is a revolutionary agent, again, in our introduction, we gesture to the importance of theorizing gender and race as well as part of our understanding of the capitalist state. And I think, if we look around the struggles that happen today, a lot of them are anti-racist struggles. A lot of them are struggles over the working conditions of reproductive workers, care workers, all of those workers. And I think it would be extremely productive if we move away from sort of a very strict reading of the revolutionary agent as a sort of traditional working class, and extend it to sort of extend anti-capitalist struggles, include within them struggles over reproduction, struggles against racism, etc. And so unite the different struggles, but not in a sort of kind of intersectional, let's join all forces, but to offer a theory of the capitalist state that truly sees them as interconnected systems of exploitation and oppression that find different articulations within our understanding of the states. And that, I think, will give us some ways in which to move forward on what can be a truly sort of more revolutionary strategy. Some very thoughts. That's $1 million question, as I say. So not quite easy to answer it.
Thank you, Eva. There's one, two actually remaining questions, and I'd like to ask that for those panelists who can stay on, let's try and answer them before everyone has to leave. And thank you to everyone who has stayed with us over time. So first, there's a question of, can the speaker say more about the ways in which a Marxist critique of the capitalist state may clear the ground for a Marxist theory of state legitimacy? What are the internal resources for Marxism that offer a theory of state legitimacy, and how can we engage, for example, liberal theories of state legitimacy, such as Anna Stiltz's legitimate state theory? I'd like to respond to this one, if I may, and I want to say I'm truly not just trying to be flippant when I say that Marxists don't need a theory of state legitimacy, because legitimacy is an answer to questions that Marxists shouldn't be answering. Shouldn't be asking. Stiltz is actually a great example here. She's working in sort of Rawlsian and Rawlsian adjacent Anglophone academic political theory, where legitimacy is state legitimacy. In other words, the rightness or the okayness of states coercing and dominating and being violent is predicated on the idea of whether or not a state commands popular consent to do those things, to be violent and dominating, or can fairly be said to be representing a common will or a common interest. And various chapters in this volume make clear that these are at best incoherent concepts. The idea of a single common good shared by a territorially defined national community, political community, that such a concept is a reification, or it can be said to be something that abstracts away from the reality of capitalist exploitation and heteronomy and domination. And these legitimacy, state legitimacy in liberal political thought is about legitimacy in the eyes of or with respect to citizens. And the abstract citizen is not the way I want to suggest that Marxists should be thinking about social individuals. And so a Marxist theory of state legitimacy is a critique of the concept of state legitimacy. Now, there's a not totally different, but there's a somewhat different question here that I don't think was the one that was being asked, but we can mention it, which is, what would public power look like in an emancipated society that is not dominated by capital? And it's tempting to think that that would still look like something that is either legitimate or not legitimate, that like legitimation is something that would matter to that. I don't have a response to that. I do think that transformed social relations are still going to see some kind of institutional mediation, but I don't want it to look anything like the state as we know it right now. And for that reason, I'm not sure that legitimacy is the right frame in which to be thinking about that. I'd like to invite anyone else to chime in on this question, and then we should turn to the final question.
I want to jump in just very quickly to make a point that I think also might connect to what Eva just said a moment ago, which is that I think it would also be useful, taking everything that Rob just said, to also draw a distinction between legitimacy and legitimation. And I think it's possible to speak of legitimation as a particular kind of ideological practice that the capitalist state does deploy on a regular and a consistent basis in order to generate that impression of unity, of the common good, of the public good that Rob was just so aptly critiquing. And we can kind of think of, in more abstract terms, of the idea of the nation, the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea of kind of one person, one vote, of formal legal equality, as all of these particular practices by which the state does generate legitimacy as a as one of its kind of modes of in a broader hegemonic project that it seeks to maintain within capitalist society. That being said, it's a process, and it's not always going to be a successful process, and this process is always contradictory and always kind of driven by and fractured and fragmented by processes of class struggle, by social struggle that challenge and contest the boundaries on which that legitimation occurs. So, as Eva was just saying a moment ago about how Marxists need to theorize race and gender and the role of the capitalist state in reproducing that, not in let's say the terms of liberal intersectionality, but in terms of articulation and how you might recover and actually articulate a more revolutionary understanding of the way that these identities actually fuse together into a political formation or a social formation of some kind. That can then contest the account of legitimation and the process of legitimation that the capitalist state presents in its own right. So I think that's just kind of my little addendum to what Rob was saying, in the sense of if we think of legitimation as in tandem with notions like ideology and notions like hegemonic project, I think we can get a more intelligible sense of how a Marxist critique of that term might also work.
I could just chime in very briefly and say, as joining the chorus of political theorists, I do think, I agree with what Rob and Rafael just said, and I think it's also, maybe rather than developing, a Marxist theory of legitimacy, I do think it's one of the reasons we need to revive a lot of the state theory tradition is to sort of point to some of the limitations of what is now the by far dominant theories of the state in political theory, which there's almost no kind of question or critique of most liberal state theories, and I think it's really I think it's a problem for political theory. Frankly, it just means that there are real limits to what people are able to say and do, and as Raphael's work has done, a lot of the most interesting debates within political theory, even non-Marxist ones, are ones that originally came out of debates with and against Marxists. So hopefully that can at least reinvigorate some work in our field. But I do think that pointing out the ways that even the sort of the vision of whether it's democratic theorists or theorists of legitimacy usually is sort of there are even people who don't necessarily think they're doing ideal theory are doing ideal theory, and the ways that's really sort of not realizable in our actual world, I think are important to point out. And I think this is another thing that having that going back to state theory can do.
Okay, last question was one of the first, and I invite everyone to jump in. It was phrased as a question for Alyssa: how did Nate and Chris's presentations fit in the quadrant? And I know I said I would force everybody to shoehorn themselves in. You don't have to, but I do think that this would be a good closing exercise to explore the quadrant that Alyssa laid out in her chapter. So again, it's a 2x2 grid. It's in good management consulting fashion, and
wow, ouch.
No, I love it. It's it is a powerful tool. So on the I don't think I have my display mirrored, so this is actually going to show it backward and fuzzy because it's not a face. Never mind.
Yeah,
perfect. Thank you. Okay, even better. Great. Now I don't have to describe it to you in painstaking detail.
Oh, I should have done this for my presentation.
So I'll go first and put myself on the spot. I'm in the doom and gloom quadrant. So the structural and capitalist, socially and ecologically destructive quadrant. Now, as to whether or not capital is self-destructive, someone once said that the real barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. And it's, looked at different ways, we can come to different conclusions about whether or not capitalism is self-destructive. But I do think that the capitalist state is a real barrier to not only to overcoming the degradation and destruction to overcoming human domination of nature and the destruction of biodiversity and ecosystems, but also a barrier to emancipation. But I'll stop there. No one else is willing to fit to.
I probably would be, and I think I'm probably in the top left. So I don't think that capital's destruction of nature is self-destructive, or at least it's not until the point. I think I think that Burkett and Foster are basically right that it destroys certain sectors. Like there's a point at which you maybe have you have repercussion. A sort of cascading crises, but it's not clear to me what the sort of that there's enough of a feedback loop to for capital to be sort of in a capitalist crisis that is not already like a state of total. I mean, again, eventually, but like there's so much, there's so many levels of destruction of social and ecological life that are not sort of feeding back into capital before you get there. That I think it's not a thing to put bets on. I'm very skeptical of some of the claims that people like Jason Moore have made about like an apocalyptic crisis of capitalism of late. So I am on that side, and I'd probably place myself somewhere in the class struggle side of the state capital relationship. I had a conversation with Rafael about just I think there's a lot again, this is very stylized, and I think there's a lot of interesting points of like pushing beyond these categories also, which in some ways Chris's I think actually Chris's presentation, if I had to answer, I feel like is kind of moving off the chart in a lot of ways, right? Like it is, these kind of are mapping onto the two positions that Chris laid out to some degree, and I think you're right that there's something inadequate about both of them as they've been articulated thus far. So hopefully in our maybe the next version of this chart we'll have like a whole new position.
I mean, I would quite like to try and place myself, but I think I don't fit anywhere. I mean, I think on that, at least in terms of my chapter, I tried in terms of the state capital relation. I mean, I try to show a middle course in the sense that I'm more towards the sort of structural side, but then I try to also think of the ways in which the structural, in as much as it doesn't only act as a constraint, but also sometimes it leads to crisis, and that's if we see also the class struggle not only as the originator of class crisis, but also the executor of crisis, we also have ways in which the structure creates opportunities for the class struggle that then can sort of take it over. So I like to think of the interaction between these two levels in terms of the cracks and opportunities it opens. And in terms of self-destructive or not self-destructive, my chapter, I think, points to the fact that no, we ought not to think as capital will self-destroy itself from within without struggle and without a fight. I think this is something that Marx himself came quite sort of vividly to reckon with by the events in France, among other things. And so, yeah, I would just say that I'm somewhere trying to combine the two in a way that's, however, more kind of multidimensional than maybe what has happened so far. I think Chris and Nate want to also.
Yeah, go for it.
Chris, I think you were first, but I'm happy to go if you want to go clean up. Okay, so I would say I feel like I'm mostly in the top left quadrant. I don't think like Alyssa. I agree with you, Alyssa. I don't think capitalism is self-destructive. Unfortunately, I think we could have a genuine species level apocalypse. So there's 10,000 humans left, and those 10,000 humans are stuck in an especially dystopian version of capitalism. So I don't think we apocalypse our way out of capitalist social relations. Unfortunately, there's nothing another way to put it. There's nothing inherent. There's nothing about capitalism generates catastrophes, and those catastrophes have no inherently emancipatory potential. Um, and I would also say um, there's a difference between modes of class struggle that are like alt capitalism, right? Like you fight like hell for fight like a hell for a capitalism in which I can survive. And again, that stuff can be literally life or death. But that's not, despite the righteousness and the genuine heroism and values of all that and so on. That's not intrinsically anti-capitalist. And so I think there's a strong difference between battles over variations on capitalism, despite our humanitarian wishes for their success, and anti-capitalist revolutionary struggle. And I think it's one of the ironies of capitalism is that some of the I think Marx on the Factory Acts in Volume 1, Chapter 10 of Capital is really good on this. Is that capitalism at that time is headed for a kind of catastrophe that's going to undermine the preconditions for that particular arrangement of capitalism, and a major force for causing that arrangement to give way is working class struggle, but what it gives way toward is an alternative form of capitalism. And so, to my mind, we should expect that all actually existing concrete particular forms of capitalism will be temporary, and we should expect, absent fairly extraordinary revolutionary struggle, that when those forms in their temporariness give way, they'll give way to a different version of capitalism. And I think there's a long history of the kind of soft left, social democratic left, and not only those forces, conflating a deeply important human level life or death struggle for an alternative form of capitalism with anti-capitalism.
Chris, do you want the last word?
Sure. Apologies if you can hear my dogs going crazy for dinner, or maybe a package came or something. I don't know if you can hear them or not. So I think, I think I can't believe I was going to say it, but I was literally just going to say, I think there is a third way. And then I realized I didn't want to end up sounding like Tony Blair. But I think the DOS, right, is it's a good, this is a good representation of the more popular debates. But, I think where I would start from is sort of the idea of, that struggle and structure are not antithetical, but that, structure is, constituted by class struggle. And, I think I would tie this to the point of, capital accumulation being one of permanent crisis. And then I think finish on sort of the pessimistic idea of, admittedly, I've been reading, I'm working on a chapter on Adorno, so I've been reading way too much Adorno. But it's not just nature in terms of ecology, it's how the social domination of nature becomes second nature. So it's the sense in which, it's a sense in which the pessimistic question is, if either of these two things happen, will they just be naturalized? If capitalism continuously destroys the environment, who's to say subsequent generations will not just see that as, nature qua necessity, and, not do anything to change it? And how will that sort of counteract sort of Burkett and Foster's argument that it's just like a straightforward case of harm? in what sense is productivism sort of naturalized to the extent that, we already view nature instrumentally, and we can't even envision what a non-dominative relationship to nature would be. So I guess I would, try and draw my own sort of strange, quadrant off to the side.
Well, thank you, everyone
So
who
what you're
stuck it
saying-
out this far. Oh,
What
yeah.
you're saying,
Go
Chris, is
ahead,
that
Mark.
it's a 3D model. It's actually a cube, not a 2x2.
Exactly. We need to build the cube, right? In the next 3-dimensional
That-
edited collection, released in virtual reality.
I can't think of a better way to end this than to say, build the cube.
We're waiting
so-
for Zoom to introduce a holographic component. That's what
Right.
so we can just
Thank you to our audience. Many, many thanks to Fred and Steve and everyone at the Marxist Education Project. This has been great. And thanks, everyone, for your interest. And get in touch. And we hope that that this was useful, and that you check out more programming from the MEP. And thank you.
Thank you. And
thank you, Rob, and the
Thanks,
rest
everyone.
of you panelists. And we appreciate your appreciation.
Thanks, everyone.
And we appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you at further events and
maybe
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, everyone.
6 months or so from now, as you get reactions to the book, we can have you back to whether you've amended any of your ideas or new ideas.
Yeah, maybe so.
Be great. And we look forward to reading it ourselves, so we'll have some things to say.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Take care.
everyone.